So, thank you for attending this second roundtable. I have the pleasure to announce the next panel, which will focus on governance in crisis. Just a few words to introduce our moderator, Elie Baranet. Elie has been a research fellow at IRSEM on international security since 2019. At IRSEM, he is also in charge of the partnership with the College of International Security Affairs affiliated with the NDU in Washington, D.C. And his current research focuses on the causes of armed conflicts, on the link between political regime and war, and more specifically, on the strategic impact of political discourses. He also teaches courses on international relations and US foreign policy in various institutions, including Sciences Po Paris. His last publication, co-edited with Andrew Novo, is Turbulence Across the Sea, Transatlantic Relations and Strategic Competition, University of Michigan Press, that was published 1 month ago or something like that. Yeah, congrats. Yeah, enjoy the round table.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. Welcome to this second round table on government in crisis. Thank you for all speakers this morning. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Bretton Borell. Bretton is Associate Professor of Astropolitics. That's the coolest title I've ever read regarding social sciences. Associate Professor, so I'm saying it again, Associate Professor of Astropolitics at the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University and an expert in space warfare and astropolitics. He's the author of 2 monographs, Original Sin, Power, Technology and War in Outer Space in 2022, and
you need to speak.
And War in Space, Strategy, Space Power, Geopolitics 2020, and multiple peer-review articles. His research focuses on space power and strategic theory, space policy and politics, military, space history, technology and modern warfare, international relations, security and intelligence in space. That's it? No other item. Miss, I don't remember how to pronounce it, you just told me 5 minutes ago. Tune Karjalainen, thank you, is a researcher in the European Union research program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Her research focuses on the EU foreign and security policy, EU enlargement, and differentiated integration in the EU. Tine is currently a doctoral researcher in political science at the University of Turku, focusing on the EU Eastern neighborhood policies. Her 2 most recent publications in 2024 are EU Support for Ukraine, the Paradox of Insufficient Assistance, Imagining, and the second one is Imagining Peace and Producing Knowledge about the War in Ukraine. And finally, Kamil Zwolski is Jean Monnet Professor of European Security, Director of the Center for Comprehensive European Security and Associate Professor of International Politics at the University of Southampton. He published this year, a little bit earlier, his 3rd book, Researching European Security Integration at Palgrave, which opens up new methodological, theoretical, and empirical research avenues for the benefits of the young generations of scholars studying the EU. So I would like to organize this panel in 3 steps. First round of questions regarding the general topic of government in crisis, and 2 more specific questions. So regarding government in crisis, this is a recurring theme in international politics. Is this true? Is this a narrative? This is one of the first questions that I would like you to answer. The crisis we talk about is usually said to have the characteristics of a global crisis. The crisis regards all dimensions, political, functional dimensions, values also, political because the return of global competition, of great power competition, is usually conducted at the expenses of international norms and procedures. You have the practice of lawfare, which consists in using law for your own interest. Governance in general is not so trusted anymore. It is said to be against the will of states. Regarding the functional problems, we'll tackle them a little bit later for our second questions. But if I turn to values, we can obviously see that there are very different opposing narratives today at the global scales. States have different standards. Promoting human rights and democracy has become harder. It's become attacked from, I would say, both sides, from non-statu quo powers, of course, which will try to undermine the basic principles of the existing international order, because this is precisely the one they want to be undermined, but also from the states that are considered that the pillars of this international order, and especially from within. So democracy and human rights are principles that are questioned more and more. And you can see that the double standard argument is a very powerful one at the hand of non-Western states. Basically, the idea that you are supposed to be the representative of human rights and the international order based on rule, and you actually don't respect it at all. The perfect example would be the Iraq War. And this is an argument that is extremely strong to undermine I would say, the legitimacy of the US and its allies to represent faithfully a rule-based order. I would like to know what's your take on that regarding the general question, but more specifically, based on your research and your personal experience. Bretton? This one works.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'll just comment very briefly on the space dimensions then of that question, which should be no shock to anyone. Yeah, in terms of whether there's a crisis or not, no, not really. Business as usual, I think. If anything, it's actually more optimistic. I'm more optimistic now than I was maybe compared to 10 years ago, because things are actually happening when it comes to governance in space. There's much more interest in trying to understand what the problems are facing the international community in space, in particular on the problem of space debris. So that issue is far more salient now, but it's far more better understood and recognized as something that needs to be addressed. And that is triggering a lot more discussion in terms of norms, soft law, regulations, common threat perceptions, in a way that just wasn't happening 10, 15 years ago, or when I started working as an actual researcher and academic in this field. In particular, the UK-led efforts at the UN General Assembly on trying to identify common threats and responsible behaviours in space, deliberately trying to break the deadlock that's been at the Conference on Disarmament, Paros and Copuos, at the United Nations, where there's been very little progress in most areas, with exception to the long-term sustainability guidelines in 2018, which tried to have some detailed agreements between states. So I'm actually quite optimistic, more so than I have been in recent years. But compared to other domains or areas of international governance, we're coming up from quite a low bar as well, I think, compared to other places. So I guess the only way is up in space, maybe? I'm not sure. So I guess that'll be my opening statement to that.
Very well, thank you. Tina?
All right, thank you so much. I was thinking that since I'm working on EU as a security actor, I'll just focus on the question where the EU actually has developed as a security actor through this crisis that we have had since this full-scale aggression started. You know, this is the kind of what everyone wants to say about the EU, how it develops through crisis. And I wanted to use this opportunity to reflect on 2 articles that I've been writing about this topic, and actually to explain, because what we actually see, you know, is that the EU actually did change since into 2022, right, as a security actor. So if you are not familiar with what happened, the EU is previously known, as this more civilian actor, more soft power, and now it is actually funding weapon deliveries to Ukraine and training Ukrainian troops on the European soil. So there is a shift in the EU's security actorness and in its policies. But what is behind this shift? What actually enabled this shift to take place? So I have two explanatory frameworks in a way. The first one, and I'm sorry, these are a bit academic explanations maybe, but please try to believe me. These are interesting. At least I find this interesting. So the first one is about complementary roles of the member states. I do argue that the different roles that the EU member states took in 2022 and a bit before, and how these roles interacted, kind of enabled the EU to take this shift in its security policies. France, for a long time, has played this role of an advocate for more strategic autonomy in Europe, right? Pushing towards developing more European tools for security and defense. Germany, preferring a more institutional and multilateral approach to European Security and Defense Agency, kind of shared or was enough on the same page with France to an extent that we saw development of EU tools such as the European Peace Facility, right? Then when the full-scale war started, we saw states like Poland or the Baltic states taking this very active, quick role of actually delivering weapons to Ukraine. And these roles then encouraged more hesitant states like Finland to also deliver weapons to Ukraine. And I do argue that the fact that we had the EPF, the European Peace Facility, in place because of these mentioned developments actually also encouraged both Poland and the Baltic states to empty their stocks because they could count on receiving the funding, but also it had this kind of more political support for states like Finland to actually take this quite sensitive and difficult decision to give weapons to a state in a war. So these kind of complementary roles. Then, of course, we have already started to see how these, for some time, complementary roles have become more conflicting roles. These we see kind of reversing role changes. So France having this position that the EPF money needs to be spent on European defense material produced in Europe. Germany becoming unhappy with its big share of the EPF costs, and this kind of Hungary, of course, blocking the whole use of the EPF to support Ukraine. Then the other explanatory framework, I'll be really short, is about strategic cultures. And in this article, both of these are in peer review, we do argue with my colleague Katarina Mustasilta that the EPF as a case is kind of interesting as it showcases a level of shared strategic culture among the European states in a way that there was enough shared understanding about the threat of Russia and enough shared understanding about the preferred role of the European Union in responding to this threat. And this level of shared understanding then enabled us to use the EPF to support Ukraine. And at the same time, the EPF then actually shaped the national responses, as I just explained, that it encouraged some states to give more support. And the use of the EPF to support Ukraine was also this kind of shared, or it was kind of an exercise for that also developed strategic culture, shared strategic culture in the European Union, because it was, the EU learns every time we do something together, then soon it is in our strategic documents, because we kind of learn through these kind of experiences and exercises. But then the key question, and I'll end up soon, was this only kind of an overlap of strategic cultures for a moment during this crisis, or was it actually about approximation, right? Did we actually come closer, or was this kind of an overlap of strategic cultures for a moment of a crisis? And what happens when the war is over? Do we then see all European countries reversing back to their earlier conflicting positions where they have very different threat perceptions, different understandings about the role of the EU? And our answer, or my answer in both of these articles, is that yes, in a way, we are kind of see this kind of reversing development in terms of re-emerging conflicts and re-emerging divisions, but the EU as an institution has already changed more permanently. The EU now has become an actor that can deliver weapons or fund weapon deliveries, and we cannot take this back. And now the EU is expected to be this actor globally. And now the EU has also a lower threshold to give weapons, to Niger or Somalia. So we have this kind of like, while the member states might be going back to their conflicting positions, the EU has already changed more permanently. So this was my opening. Thank you. I hope I was not too long.
Okay, thank you very much. We were invited to consider the question whether the international governance is in crisis. So my immediate kind of response to that, and the first thought that I had was, whose governance are we talking about? Globally, there has never been a working system of governance. The United Nations has been effective to the extent that great powers allowed it to be effective. The United Nations has been relatively successful in domains that are not security related strictly, like poverty reduction. The word crisis entails temporality. It means to signify an exception to the rule. Something is working as intended, and then it stops working, and there is a crisis. At the global level, international system of governance has never worked as intended. At the national and regional level, again, whose governance is in crisis? Whose governance are we talking about? Russia has never been part of the same system of governance as Western Europe, the European Union, or NATO. We can debate whether it was unwisely excluded from that system of governance or it excluded itself. But the system of governance is not in crisis from the Russian perspective. On the contrary, Russia is the governance disruptor. China has been developing, largely benefiting from Russia positioning itself as a governance disruptor. Also, China is building its own system of governance in the South China Sea based on the rules designed in Beijing. So for China, the international system of governance is not in crisis, it is merely emerging. So again, whose governance is in crisis? And the answer is that the post-World War II transatlantic system of security is in crisis, and it also includes the broader notion of transatlantic community of values. If we narrow it down, we can say that the European system of security is definitely in crisis. And for Europe, crisis comes from three directions primarily. It, of course, comes from the East. It comes from Russia, which has shattered the normative system of sovereignty as outlined or established in the peace treaties of Westphalia and enshrined in the UN Charter. It also comes from the United States, which is increasingly questioning the principles and values on which the transatlantic system, the community, is based. And it finally comes from within, with Europeans in many countries challenging the value of established institutions, political parties, and norms. To finish my brief introduction, I would like to make one final observation. It may seem to us, Europeans, that this is a relatively new situation and that the dilemmas we are facing are somehow unprecedented. Well, in 1923, that is 101 years ago, Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi published his widely popular and influential at the time book called Pan-Europa, or Pan-Europe. In it, he argued for a pan-European union, a federal form of European integration to protect Europe from three threats. The threat coming from Soviet Russia in the form of potential military aggression, the threat coming from America in the form of economic competition, and the threat coming from within Europe in the form of destructive nationalisms. So there we are, coming back full circle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I can see already that, based on your opening statements, that we can use the few minutes at the end for discussion. Probably you have some things to say and different perspective maybe to compare. To turn now to the second aspect of our discussion, some of which you already started to mention, and we can now try to examine them a little bit further. The crisis of governments regarding the new tools and mechanisms at the disposal of the different actors. As it's been already said, the US system at some regards is considered deadlocked, that international regimes are getting weaker, even if Bledin will disagree to some extent regarding this statement. That states use alternative forums to bypass traditional multilateral arenas that we call minilateralism. Yet several sectors, cyber, space, European defense, require new regulation, but at this regard also traditional governance mechanisms appear to be sidelined in favor of other instruments and means of cooperation. We sometimes read notions such as forum shopping, forumisation, minilateralisms in the literature to describe these practices. What I would like to know is what are these new tools and mechanisms in your domains, if they are so? Are they effective? How do we continue to create norms in the EU or at the global stage? And do you see different kinds of deliberation logics depending on the kind of forum actors participate in?
Thanks very much. I guess this is where I maybe revert to type and become pessimist again and sort of argue a bit against what I said earlier. So in terms of the new mechanisms, there is that ground for optimism regarding the UN General Assembly resolution approach to developing norms for space, and we'll see what the open-ended working group manages to do that over the next few years, even with Russia acting as a spoiler in that process. But so the plus side for that as a new tool and approach is that it's allowed a new way for different actors and participants to be involved in discussing norms and governance in outer space, because the established forums such as the Conference on Disarmament, PAROS and COPUOS, they've been deadlocked for longer than I've been alive on the same issues, and many countries just don't want to get involved in that because they see it for the deadlock that it is. So the General Assembly effort and the open-ended working group has been a great educational and training opportunity for a lot of other countries that now have direct interests in the governance of outer space because they have economic interests there, or they rely on the space infrastructure that is in space in a way that they didn't 30 years ago. So that has been a really important dialogue, education, and sort of exposure opportunity really for a lot of new actors in space. However, it's not going to resolve the long-standing political issues that many of the bigger powers have had for so long. It's a question of, will they be able to get agreements at the margins where some compromises, some common ground can be found? And we've seen now emerging really of the efforts of the Chinese and Russian desire to have a space weapons treaty become part of the open-ended working group on common space threats and responsible behaviors. Because the resolution approach does not foreclose the possibility of treaties at the end of a process, and even then the treaty's not the end. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 began as resolutions with the UN General Assembly. So things that are passed with the UNGA can become treaty at some point, and so we'll see in the next 10, 20 years whether that gets anywhere. But as Camille was saying, it will happen if the great powers or the big powers decide that they actually want this to progress. So I don't really care too much about new methods and approaches because they have to actually resolve the political disputes. And for me, the method doesn't matter too much. What matters is the political will and the desire to solve specific problems. And I guess in space, it's very fashionable right now to trash and attack the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which was a product of détente in the 60s, and arms control in terms of banning the deployment of nuclear weapons in space was a big part of the Outer Space Treaty. But it's the framework for all international laws in space that we have. And a lot of criticism of the Outer Space Treaty revolves around laser critiques of, oh, it's from 1967, technology and politics has moved on so much since then. No, it hasn't. I can read stuff from the 1970s and 1980s on space arms control, and it's as relevant. You can basically copy and paste, and which is indeed what many Russian and Chinese diplomats do. Copy and paste the same statements they've been making for the past 50 years or so on these issues. And they're still like the same talking points, and they're still addressing the same supreme political and security concerns. So the Outer Space Treaty is a big framework, and many of its many of its opponents or critiquers, they don't actually spell out what is it about the Outer Space Treaty that is preventing them from doing what they want to do, and why can't they just build on that framework. So we have subsequent treaties in the system already regarding the return of astronauts to their launcher states, or the registration of objects in the UN database for what they launch into space. So these things can be built within the Outer Space Treaty rather than having a brand new system. The challenge is, of course, is that if you start unpacking components of the Outer Space Treaty that you don't like, other actors then will see it as an excuse to start unpacking other parts of the Outer Space Treaty, and you could end up unraveling it. And given the current great power climate, we're never going to have something like the Outer Space Treaty ever again. So careful if you're going to start tampering with the Outer Space Treaty rather than building upon it and creating subsidiary treaties, which may be what happens with the Artemis Accords at some point. We don't know as well. Or if China and America agree on some form of common lunar governance as well. I think also, just a last point here on sort of tools, I think we also have to look at other dimensions and how new tools don't often actually resolve the same problems. My favorite example right now is the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the TPNW, which for years I saw it's not going to actually resolve the problem of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty regarding how do you actually do nuclear disarmament? And it's got nothing new to offer on that supreme political problem. And lo and behold, TPMW has run its course. People have had their coffee and croissants for years about it, and it's done nothing to address the problem of nuclear proliferation. So I would be cautious against, in the space field, people thinking, well, we need new approaches. No, you need to solve political problems. We have the mechanisms and the forums in place to do it in many different ways. The UNGA effort was a good addition, but we need to grapple with politics, power, and security, not so much new mechanisms. So I'll end there. Hopefully that's provoked some responses.
All right, thank you so much. I hope this does not become too kind of random for the audience, since I also will use this opportunity to kind of approach this topic from a very the point of view of my research, so it's a very different one, but I think we have this nice role. You are a very specialist, and then we have a big thinker, and I'm here. Now I put my think tanker hat on and will give you a very EU think tanker answer to this question about how to move forward when we with this situation. This is a piece that I already published, so this is about how do we move forward with this very big gap between the objectives and the reality in EU defense. And this refers to what you mentioned about minilateralism or even forum shopping, because this is a phenomenon that we have seen for a long time in EU defense, that since we cannot move forward all together because we don't agree basically on anything, then we just formulate these small groups, right? We have had CHEF for Northern European security, okay, not inside the EU, but we consider these frameworks as flexible defense cooperation frameworks near the EU, or somehow operating in the margins of the EU and NATO, so in the European sphere of defense cooperation. We have had the EA2 and we have had PESCO, and all these examples of flexible defense cooperation. And my argument is not that we should end this kind of forum shopping. Instead, I do think that these kind of flexible formats of cooperation have served as a bridge in the past towards more unified cooperation, towards what we could even imagine as integration in European defense policies. And topically, I just want to mention a few examples. We have this PESCO project on military mobility, which I think is a quite nice example of how flexibility in defense cooperation in Europe can be quite effective. So this project takes into account that not every EU member states want to be involved in and do with defense. So it is about differentiation in a way that you can opt out, like Denmark opted out from CSDP in the past. But then also we can take along external partners such as the UK, the US, Norway, and with this grouping, focusing on a very specific challenge that we have, which is that it's very difficult to move any military material inside Europe, we then address this specific problem. Another example of this flexibility is, of course, the very institutional solutions that we have in the EU tools, such as the European Peace Facility that I was talking about before. We could not have used it if we did not have this kind of inbuilt flexibility inside the instrument that then allowed some neutral states to opt out, or it is about constructive abstention, right? So I do think that this kind of flexibility is the way forward, also for trying to fill the gap in between the. I don't need to give you the why this is needed, you know, because we expect the US to be less engaged in European defense in the future. We have the huge need for more effective capabilities. So what we could actually do? I do think, of course, there is the challenge of decision making. I'm not going to go to Taiwan, but I would kind of advocate for this idea of islands of cooperation in European defense also from now on, and because we could also frame this as not as either or approach, but more as this kind of both and approach. So when we have issues such as should we prioritize European defense industries or buy from the international market when we are now filling our stocks or supporting Ukraine, it's not an either or question, but we could actually have these coalitions or groups or islands of cooperation where we focus on both actually. So we need, because we actually need both, right? We need a coalition focusing on developing European defense industry, and then we need a coalition or a cooperation that focuses on just buying equipment really quickly where it is needed, so in Ukraine. And if there is a grouping that can adapt together, then we need to have that grouping. And then those that cannot take, for some reasons, adapt, are not in favor of it, then they can work in a different way. So I do believe in this kind of patchwork approach in EU defense. In one previous article that we published, we then discussed like how legitimate or effective is this, like when we have this much differentiation, and we came to a conclusion that yes, there is the risk of fragmentation indeed, but how to mitigate this fragmentation is to involve the institutions as much as possible, so the EU institutions in this case, and then also try, of course, one mitigating factor is that it is the same member states most often participating in these many frameworks at the same time. So there is coordination through the European capitals. And then also we came to a very, this is maybe a not surprising outcome, that as long as these different frameworks align with the shared objectives, they are likely to be quite legitimate in the eyes of the EU citizens, basically. So for instance, we did realize that we have had some frameworks that did not really align with the objectives that have been agreed on. So then they were less legitimate, while some that really aligned with the shared objectives were rather legitimate, even though not every member state was on board. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the question that we were invited to address is, what are the new governance tools and mechanisms in your domain? Are they effective? How do we continue to create norms in the EU at the global level? So in my domain, which is European and international security, there are no fundamentally new kinds of governance tools and mechanisms. Everything that we have today has its roots in the post-World War II period. First, we have the very imperfect system of global collective security as defined by the UN Charter and embodied by the UN Security Council. This system of governance has proven resistant to change. Second, we have systems of collective defense as defined by Article 51 of the UN Charter, and the best example of this is NATO. Third, we have the proliferation of regional systems of cooperation as defined by Article 52 of the UN Charter. These are organizations such as the European Union, African Union, the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Some of these organizations, of course, are more advanced and better developed than others, the EU, of course, being the most advanced of them all. So that's what we have, that's where we are. We have an imperfect system of global security governance. We have one strong collective defense alliance, and we have a range of regional political, security, and economic organizations. It is this third category of governance which is most dynamic and which contributes to our collective sense of crisis and anxiety in Europe. This especially applies to organizations where Russia and China are playing a leading role. So one question we were invited to address is how effective are these new organizations? What I will say here is that we should not project our own view of regional integration, the view that has been shaped by our own experience of European integration, onto other organizations. The reason that we use the terms that you mentioned, the forum shopping, forumisation, or minilateralism, is that outside perhaps of a country like Russia, countries have diverse interests and they are often interested in closer, mutually beneficial cooperation with Europe, even when those countries are part of organizations with Russia. This message resounded very strongly at the Europe's Strategic Choices Conference in Berlin last week, organized by Chatham House, where representatives from South America or Africa discussed the prospects of more balanced cooperation with Europe. Finally, the question was, how do we continue to create norms in the EU or at the global level? I will just make a point about the global level. The best way the EU can continue to promote its norms at the global level is through being the kind of community that other countries may want to create for themselves. There is no other way. But also, the EU has to be the kind of community that Europeans want and are proud of. I'm uncertain about the extent to which this is the case today. To finish again on a slightly controversial note, which I like to do, I recently came across this sentiment that the European Union hates Europeans, which means that it is detached from what European citizens want and care about. Now, we will all likely disagree with this sentiment, and for the good reasons. But I think it's futile to disregard it altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. International governance consists of norms, procedures, and institutions designed to mitigate the effects of the balance of power between nations and to provide stability. However, international governance, as any form of social structure, is not created out of the blue. It reflects the existing balance of power among its members, and this is an issue that you've already started to examine, and I would like us to go a little bit deeper here. Is international governance or governance at the more regional level a remedy for the balance of power, or is it a reflection of it? And where do you stand on this? We think, based on also what Camille said a little bit earlier, that the League of Nations was quite ambitious, but didn't maybe reflect the balance of power as much as the UN did, and maybe that was the reason why the League of Nations failed, why the UN was more successful. And also, based on that, can norms and institutions, once established, regardless of the environment in terms of great power competition, can these norms and institutions live a life of their own outside strategic competition?
Thanks. Yeah, several very big questions there. So I won't be able to answer all of those satisfactorily, I don't think, but I'll give it a go. Yeah, so generally the impact of great power competition on governance and thinking of the space dimension in particular. Well, space has always been an environment that's been extremely sensitive for the major powers of the international system for a very long time. So arms control has always been a significant dimension of it, but generally speaking, the more economic and environmental dimensions and governance in space we're seeing now are, relatively new areas, but they impinge on military freedom of action and security policies and the use of space for military services, which means that progress is extremely hard, and that's even before things deteriorated a lot between China, Russia, and the United States in the 2010s. So the interesting thing, though, is that despite that deterioration in relations, the United States has given a lot of impetus to the resolution, as the UNGA resolution approach and norm building in space, because it finally decided and realized that it was probably unwise to fundamentally block all Russian and Chinese attempts at having some form of new space weapons treaty, whilst also blocking or not engaging with other countries' attempts to develop some form of soft laws or norms for the governance of outer space. So the State Department and the Pentagon and the White House, first in the Trump administration, but also in the Biden administration, really changed their tune on this and decided, right, we can actually start seizing the agenda with norms and soft law in space. And in terms of other forms of governance beyond the international level, as I was talking to Uri last night about this, when it comes to international law and mechanisms and implementing them, they only matter insofar as they are recognized in domestic legislative arenas and then enforced by the states. So when it comes to space, the Outer Space Treaty is really important because it is recognized, I think, in almost every domestic space law that is then subsequently written and approved by the legislatures of states. When it comes to things like space traffic management, which will be an increasing issue now for space governance because space is becoming far more busy an environment with far more satellites and far more hazardous objects or debris in space. Traffic control, traffic monitoring has to happen at a global scale and is not territorialized in any way like coastal waters or airspace are. And the United States is moving ahead with the TRACSS tracks. I can't remember what it totally stands for, but if you Google TRACSS, you'll get it up there as long as Google hasn't broken itself again. That is going to be the emergent US traffic control or traffic monitoring system. And unless other countries develop their own domestic systems or the European Union develops a system, that might become the template for everyone else to start copying and follow. And that's when you have the US exporting its standards and rules to everyone else. And if the US does a good way or does it in a good way, then great. But I'm sure there'll be other countries and industries who might complain about the American way of doing things. So just moving ahead, if the United States just moves ahead and does things in domestic law, that really sets a powerful precedent that others have to respond to or follow and copy in some way. So leading by example is really important here because international law is difficult to enforce, and the same is true for space. So there's nothing unique about international law in space there. Space is just as boring, frustrating, exciting, wonderful, horrifying as all other kinds of politics and governance issues you will be interested in on Earth. And it's just as susceptible or impenetrable to our terrestrial concepts and approaches as well. So I think there's cause for optimism there in that things are moving despite the turn in great power relations or the deterioration in great power relations. And I think what you said about islands of governance, or the like-minded nations we've heard the Trump 1 administration use and also the Biden administration, we might just see blocks develop now where US, Europe, South Korea, Japan, maybe India as well, might be able to make a lot of common ground in space governance, but it may not be anything that approaches the level of an outer space treaty or something like that. But so maybe that would be something that happens, but it won't happen if they don't legislate domestically for it. And yeah, watch what the United States does. And yeah, if you want to know what Trump means for space governance now in space, who knows? Well, what does Musk think, I think, is a question we should be asking. But yeah, I'll stop now. I'm starting to ramble. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I was thinking I use my 5 minutes to discuss the European security more broadly and norms and principles for our security order. It's actually nice that you mentioned the like-minded, because this is, the approach of the 2020s now, that we are developing security in Europe among the like-minded. But before, after the Cold War especially, but already during the Cold War, the approach was the one of cooperative security with Russia, even though it was not a like-minded country, right? And back then, when we were developing the shared principles and norms, we kind of solved the problem that many researchers are asking nowadays, like, can we actually agree on shared norms and principles with those who have very different values? Like, can we fit countries that have very different values in the same international systems? And in 1975, when we agreed on the Helsinki Decalogue, for instance, we did agree on shared norms and principles with Russia and with many countries that already back then had very different values and principles. What happened after then, of course, is the problem of international law and international governance in a way that while it is not enough that we agree on norms and values, because we don't have a supranational power to hold anyone accountable for following those norms and principles. And this is, of course, the problem that we have, especially for global powers, that we can't hold those global powers accountable for following the norms and principles that they agree on. But when it comes to European security and European security order, we already know that Russia is not a global power, right? This is not a problem that we could not hold Russia accountable. But the problem for European security order has always been one of political will, right? And this is what I and many others have been conceptualizing as one of a problem between the centers and the peripheries, right? That we actually, even in 1975 or in the years immediately after the Cold War, we actually never had one security order for the entire Europe, right? But we had a bit different rules for Western Europe and Eastern Europe. We had a bit different rules for the centers of power, and we actually turned a blind eye on violations that took place in the periphery in between. And I do think, and I guess this is the interpretation of quite many researchers today, that this is part of the reason why the security order failed then. And okay, someone might say that it did not fail because we do not have a war between Paris and Moscow right now, or Berlin and Moscow, but the war is in Ukraine. But this is exactly about the two different orders, right? So the security order that we had was one that was able to maintain stability and peace between the centers of power, but it failed entirely with the peripheries. So that's why we had Georgia, we have Transnistria, we have Ukraine, we have Belarus, and all these violations. Also many problems in Central Asia or South Caucasus, for instance. And this is a problem that I think we need to address. So while it is a problem of of accountability in the international law and governance. It is also a problem of political will, and I think something that we really topically need to discuss, because this is a moment when we start to rebuild the European security order. Next year, when we will have peace talks most likely with Russia, we can either consolidate the rules and norms and try to create a system where violations don't take place in the periphery, where we don't accept those, but we try to hold Russia accountable. And then this is of course a line, and in the other end, then we kind of return to the same security order and make the same mistakes where we give up with the principles and norms when it comes to periphery, and are like, okay, we cannot do anything, and we just need to accept this events in the periphery. So this is something this is more a question or something like a task I think that we need to topically address than anything more concrete. But it is more about not only about agreeing on norms or principles, but also how to then hold those that agreed on those accountable. Just one minor thing that then we have, of course, with a few colleagues, come to a conclusion that if it's impossible to keep countries accountable for violations, we should try to prevent those violations in the first place. And this is not something nice to say, as my background is also in peace research, but it's about deterrence, right? That if we cannot keep states accountable for breaking the international law, then we just need to deter these violations from taking place in the first place, and then concretely we need to discuss things like security guarantees for Ukraine, right? Okay, thank you.
You have been forced to listen to us for long enough. I'll keep it brief. And, is governance a remedy for the balance of power or a reflection of it? Can norms and institutions once established lead a life of their own outside strategic competition? There are two main ways to answer that. And they are probably known to most of us. First, we have the liberal way, the glass half full perspective. Here, states create the structures of international governance to build trust, prosperity, security, and peace. Once created, international organizations can indeed lead the life of their own. They can shape state preferences and domesticate international relations between states. A very nice, very positive vision of international relations. And then, of course, we have the more pessimistic realist vision, the glass half empty perspective. Here, states create structures of international governance to serve their own selfish interests. They treat international organizations as instruments to advance their own agendas, like the US treating NATO, for example. International organizations can never lead the life of their own because they will always be vulnerable to the preferences of great powers. So which perspective is more accurate? International governance structures can only be robust and effective when they are underpinned by shared norms and values. There is a reason why European Union has not been replicated nowhere else in the world, and it is not for the lack of trying. The truth is, it is not easy to get a bunch of sovereign nation states and have them create an advanced system of governance and voluntarily shift parts of their sovereignty to that structure. It's just not easy. What makes it possible is the sense of shared values, which then help those countries to get a shared sense of purpose. The Schuman Declaration is a great example of that shared sense of purpose. But if we look at the Europe today, it is not the same. In the European Union of 27 member states, diverging values compete, and the shared sense of purpose has to be worked towards instead of taken for granted. Shared values and norms are even more difficult to find among countries outside of Europe. This can be good news for Europe, because if we look at the BRICS countries, for example, the aims of Russia within that forum are different from the aims of Brazil, South Africa, and other countries, for example. To finish, Governance can be a remedy for the balance of power, but only when there is a strong sense of shared norms and values, especially as they relate to peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you.